Our next speaker now is Ghislain Gousse from the University of Nantes. Ghislain received his PhD from the University of Nantes in 2011 with a dissertation on free will and moral responsibility. He's mainly interested in metaphysics, ethics, and the philosophy of action, and he published a paper in French on David Lewis' compatibilism, and he's finishing a book on free will, also in French. So he has taught 5 years as an assistant in several universities, and he's now teaching as a high school philosophy teacher near Orléans. And so he'll be speaking today. He'll be giving 3 arguments against conditionalism.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure for me to be a part of this conference on free will and causation. I made a handout and also a PowerPoint presentation, so you can follow with the handout or with the slides, as you prefer. The title of my talk is 3 Arguments Against Conditionalism. I begin by explaining the notion of freedom I will use. I'm interested in the type of freedom required for moral responsibility. So, for simplicity's sake, I will stipulate that what is called freedom or free will is the moral freedom, that is to say, the type of freedom required for moral responsibility. Moreover, I will presuppose that this freedom requires the ability to do otherwise. In other words, I will take for granted the principle of alternative possibilities. These principles, PAP, states that a person is morally responsible for what she has done only if she was free to do otherwise. If the PAP is true, every free action is avoidable by its agent. The truth of the PAP has become controversial since Frankfurt's paper on alternative possibilities and moral responsibility. But on the other hand, the PAP is supported by a strong moral intuition, and the considerable debate around Frankfurt's argument has shown that it is not compelling. For that reason, I will consider the PAP as a plausible assumption. The question I want to address is a classical debate between the philosophers who accept the PAP. This question is whether the freedom to do otherwise is compatible with causal determinism. Let me recall what causal determinism is. Causal determinism is the claim that the conjunction of the past and the laws of nature entails a unique future. If causal determinism is true, then given the actual past and the actual laws of nature, there is one and only one future. As we know, the question of the compatibility between determinism and the freedom to do otherwise divides the philosophers in 2 camps. The leeway incompatibilists claim that determinism and the freedom to do otherwise are mutually exclusive, whereas the leeway compatibilists claim that a free action can be causally determined. For example, suppose that I intentionally perform the action of putting my right hand in my pocket. And suppose that this action was causally determined. Does it imply that I was not free to act otherwise, for instance, to raise my hand instead of putting it in my pocket? The leeway compatibilist claim is puzzling. What does it mean to say that my action was causally determined? It simply means that it was causally impossible that I raised my hand. The conjunction of the past and the laws made it impossible. But if something is causally impossible, then it cannot happen, and then I am not free to do it. To see this more clearly, we can make a comparison with another example. It seems reasonable to say that I cannot raise my hand faster than light. But why exactly is it impossible? Because for all we know, the laws of nature prescribe that such things cannot happen. So the laws of nature being what they are, they prevent that I raise my hand faster than light in such circumstances. Now, saying that it was possible that I raised my hand instead of putting it in my pocket looks like saying that I could have raised my hand faster than light. Is there any relevant difference between the 2 cases? The leeway compatibilist reply to this argument is to draw a clear-cut distinction between the can of causal possibility and the can of freedom. For the compatibilist, it is possible that an event which cannot happen in the causal sense could happen in the freedom sense. Now, the leeway compatibilist challenge is to define the sense of can he uses when he claims that he can be free to act otherwise in a deterministic world, and to show its relevance for our moral responsibility. How can the compatibilist answer this challenge? A classical compatibilist strategy is to argue that ascriptions of the ability to act otherwise should be analyzed as conditional statements. I will call this doctrine conditionalism. I borrow the term conditionalism to Peter van Inwagen in his essay on free will. There are many versions of conditionalism. According to what I will call classical conditionalism, I was free to raise my hand because if I had preferred to, I would have raised it instead of putting it in my pocket. Now, suppose that, in fact, my hands were tied up. In this case, I would not have raised it if I had chosen to raise it. So, on this view, the freedom to do otherwise should be analyzed like this. It's the analysis CC on the handout. S could have done otherwise means if S had chosen to do otherwise, S would have done otherwise. But it will be easier to work with a more general version of this analysis. After all, what the conditionalist tries to do is to explain what it means to say that an agent is able to perform an action, but not necessarily an alternative action. So, from the classical conditionalist perspective, the ability to do something should be analyzed like this. This is the analysis CC star. I changed the sentence into present tense for more clarity. So CC star, S can, so S has the freedom to do A, means if S chooses to do A, S will do A. This analysis is a definition of the freedom to act. The truth of the definiance is supposed to be a necessary and sufficient condition for the truth of the definiendum. It is often said, with good reason, that the conditionalist characterizes the ability to act otherwise negatively, as an absence of impediments. For him, I have the ability to raise my hand if and only if nothing will prevent me from doing it if I want to do it. To sum up, the core of the conditionalist compatibilism is the claim that a causal impossibility to do A removes my freedom to do A only if it is not contingent upon my will. I am free to do something if I can do it at will. That is to say, if what I do is contingent upon what I want to do. So, from that perspective, the good question is this one. According to common sense, what could remove my ability to do otherwise? In everyday life, when we say that someone couldn't have done otherwise, we mean that there was a material obstacle, something or someone, which went against his will, or would have gone against his will if he had chosen to act otherwise. Now, in a deterministic world, a difference can be made between a person who is chained and a person who is not chained. This is the distinction which is relevant to our freedom and our moral responsibility. So for the conditionalist, the mistake of the incompatibilist is to put on the same level deterministic laws of nature and material obstacles. Only material obstacles can prevent me from doing what I want to do. Classical conditionalism used to be a very popular theory among compatibilists, but now it is generally considered as a dead end. However, Kadri-Vivelin has recently proposed a new type of conditionalism, more sophisticated than the classical one. I will call it neo-conditionalism. I want to defend the leeway incompatibilist viewpoint. I will argue that neither classical conditionalism nor neo-conditionalism are a good theory of the freedom to do otherwise required for moral responsibility. For that purpose, I want to compare the merits of three arguments against conditionalism. All of these arguments are directed against classical conditionalism, but the last two can also be used against neo-conditionalism. The first argument. According to Roderick Chisholm, any conditional analysis of the ability to act is condemned to fail because we can always imagine a case in which the sufficient condition for performing an action is also a necessary condition for doing this action, but this necessary condition is not up to the agent. We can reformulate the objection in the following way. Sorry. First step, if S chooses to do A, S will do A. Second step, if S does not choose to do A, S will not do A. But since S cannot choose to do A, we may conclude that S cannot do A. In order to illustrate Chisholm's objection, let's consider a scenario described by Ghislain. Jack is offered a bowl full of small red sugar balls. If Jack chooses to take one of these red candies, he will take one. Unfortunately, he's unable to make that choice because the red sugar balls remind him drops of blood and he has a pathological aversion to blood. So he does not choose to take red candy. But suppose that if Jack does not choose to take red candy, he will not do it. Hence, given his pathological aversion, Jack is unable to take a red candy. This case seems to be a counterexample to the conditional analysis CC or CC star. Using this scenario, we can refute the classical conditionalism in the following way. It will be the first argument against conditionalism. Firstly, if Jack chooses to take red candy, he will take red candy. If Jack does not choose to take a red candy, he will not take a red candy. But Jack cannot choose to take a red candy, therefore Jack cannot take a red candy. The first premise is exactly the definition of the freedom to take a red candy according to classical conditionalism. The second premise stipulates that Jack will not take a red candy if he does not choose to. So in these circumstances, for Jack, choosing to take a red candy is a necessary condition for taking a red candy. And the third premise states that due to his pathology, Jack does not have the normal ability to choose a red candy. It seems perfectly plausible. This is an ordinary case of psychological aversion. So, from these premises, it seems reasonable to infer that Jack cannot take red candy. What might reply a conditionalist to the first argument? I can think of two options. First option. This first option is simply to deny that Jack is unable to take a red candy. Jack is free to take a candy, for it is true that he will take a candy if he chooses so. The conditionalist might point out that in the argument, the inference from the premises to the conclusion is based on a contentious model principle which John Fisher dubbed transfer of powerlessness or transfer of unavoidability. This principle is the following. This is the principle TU. In ordinary language, if it is unavoidable for a given agent S that P, and it is unavoidable for S that if P then Q, then it is unavoidable for S that Q. So let's apply this transfer to our argument. It is unavoidable for Jack that Jack does not choose to take red candy. It is unavoidable for Jack that if Jack does not choose to take red candy, then he will not take a red candy. Therefore, it is unavoidable for Jack that Jack does not take a red candy. It is well known that Peter von Inwagen's incompatibilist argument, the consequence argument, uses this model principle. He calls it the rule beta. Leaving aside the complex debate around the transfer of unavoidability, it is very natural to think that Jack's psychological pathology rendered him unable to take red candy. He has one part of the freedom to do it, namely the absence of external constraints, but he lacks something necessary to be fully able to do it, namely the freedom of choice. In fact, it seems a bit dogmatic to hold that Jack is free to take a candy. In the context of everyday life, I think almost everyone would agree that being unable to choose to do A destroys my freedom to do A, provided that doing A requires choosing to do A, of course. Maybe we can get some insight if we consider our example from the perspective of Jack's moral responsibility. As it is described, Leo's example is not morally significant, but we can easily imagine circumstances in which Jack has a moral obligation to take a red candy without taking into account the fact that Jack has a pathological aversion. In that case, Jack would appear to be, at least at first sight, blameworthy for failing to take red candy. So let's stipulate that, in this case, morality requires to take red candy. So Jack has a prima facie obligation to take red candy. Now, the question is Jack blameworthy for not doing it? I think the answer is no. Given his pathology, blaming Jack for failing to take a candy is not reasonable. It seems that, in this case, Jack does not have the kind of freedom required for responsibility, and especially blameworthiness. Let's consider the second option for the conditionalist. The second option for the conditionalist is to concede that Jack is not free to take a red candy and to revise the classical conditional analysis. Kadri Vivlin recently proposed a new conditional analysis of the freedom to do otherwise. First of all, I must point out that in analyzing the freedom to do otherwise, Vivlin is not primarily interested in the type of freedom required for moral responsibility, so I hope that my interpretation will be faithful to her view. Concerning Jack's case, Vivlin says that we must make a distinction. Jack can and cannot take the red candy. It depends on what we mean by can. If we take it as expressing the freedom of action, then we must say that Jack can take the red candy. But if we take it as expressing the freedom required for responsibility, then we must say that Jack cannot take the red candy because his will is paralyzed, so he doesn't have the ability to choose to take a candy on the basis of reasons. He's not responsive to reasons, as John Fisher would say. Even if he had the best reasons to choose a red candy, he wouldn't be able to do it. As a consequence, the conditionalist must abandon the classical analysis of the ability to act and develop a new type of conditionalism. Vivlin suggests that we change the classical analysis so as to include a causal basis which ensures that the agent is psychologically normal and that his regular capacity to act is unimpaired. What is having the causal basis for performing a given action? Roughly speaking, it is having the physical properties which gives the agent what Vivlin calls the narrow ability to perform this action, having the required skills, and being in a normal psychological and physical condition, that is to say, not being unconscious, not being paralyzed, etc. This ability is an intrinsic property of the agent. Concerning the freedom required for responsibility, Vivlin says that this causal basis includes the ability to choose to act, for having the ability to make choices on the basis of reasons is necessary for being a responsible agent. Vivlin contrasts the narrow ability with the wide ability to perform an action. Having the wide ability to do something is having the opportunity to exercise the narrow ability to do it, for instance, not being tied up. The wide ability to perform an action is a circumstantial ability. I have the wide ability to raise my hand if no external obstacles would prevent me from exercising my narrow ability to raise my hand. So, here is our new conditional analysis of the freedom to act otherwise. I recognize that Vivlin's analysis is a bit more complicated, but a simplified version will be sufficient for my purpose. Again, I hope it is faithful to her view. It's the analysis NC on the handout. And could have done otherwise means S had the causal basis required for choosing otherwise and doing otherwise. And if S had chosen to do otherwise while keeping this causal basis, S would have done otherwise. Once again, it may be clearer if we put it that way. This is the analysis NC star. S can do A means S has the causal basis required for choosing A and doing A. And if S chooses to do A while keeping this causal basis, S will do A. Clearly, Lerard's example is not a counterexample to this new conditional analysis because Jack does not have the causal basis required for choosing to take a red candy. This new conditionalism is conform to the spirit of conditionalism. In Lerard's example, there is an internal obstacle, Jack's phobia, which affects the normal work of Jack's will. But we have seen that, according to the conditionalist, being free to do A means not being prevented by obstacles to do A. So changing the analysis to exclude the possibility of psychological obstacles does not violate the spirit of conditionalism. Moreover, we must note that including in the analysis the causal basis required for choosing and doing otherwise is not an arbitrary move just to avoid the objection against conditionalism. On the contrary, it seems to be a very sensible requirement. Now, let's consider another argument against conditionalism. Frankfurt-style examples are supposed to be counterexamples to the principle of alternative possibilities, but many people have noticed that they might also be counterexamples to the conditional analysis of the ability to do otherwise. Consider the following Frankfurt-style scenario. The neurosurgeon Black knows that his patient Jones is considering murdering Smith. As he wants Jones to kill Smith, he has, unbeknownst to him, implanted in Jones's brain an electronic device in order to control his decisions. Black can predict whether Jones will or will not choose to kill Smith. If he sees that Jones is going to choose to kill Smith, he will not interrupt the process of his action. But if he sees that Jones is not going to choose to kill Smith, for example, that Jones is going to choose to spare Smith, he will force Jones to choose to kill Smith. In addition, suppose that causal determinism is true, that Jones needs to choose to spare Smith for sparing Smith, and that if Jones chose to spare Smith, Black would not intervene to force him to kill Smith, but he takes no risks since he is sure that Jones will not choose to spare Smith. It turns out that Jones chooses to kill Smith and kills Smith on his own without Black's intervention. Now we have a second argument against classical conditionalism. First step, if Jones chooses to spare Smith, he will spare Smith, because if Jones chooses to spare Smith, if Jones chose to spare Smith, Black would let him do. The second premise is that if Jones does not choose to spare Smith, he will not spare Smith. In other words, we stipulate that Jones will spare Smith only if he chooses to. Now the third premise is that Jones cannot choose to spare Smith, because if Jones showed the sign that he is about to choose to spare Smith, Black would intervene to prevent him from making this choice by forcing him to choose to kill Smith. From these three premises, it seems reasonable to infer that Jones cannot spare Smith, or, if you prefer, that Jones cannot avoid killing Smith. But note that, in this case, Jones's causal basis is intact. So we have an argument against neo-conditionalism as well. First step, Jones has the causal basis required for choosing to spare and sparing Smith, and if Jones chooses to spare Smith, he will spare Smith. Jones has the causal basis because we stipulate that the device implanted in his brain does not affect his deliberation and decision process. Then the argument proceeds in the same way as before. If Jones does not choose to spare Smith, he will not spare Smith. Jones cannot choose to spare Smith, therefore Jones cannot spare Smith. Now, what are the conditionalist options? First option, to reject the premise 3. Kadri Vivlin rejects the premise 3. On her view, Jones can choose to spare Smith. If I understand her well, her idea is that Jones has everything it takes to make this choice. He has the causal basis required, and no obstacles prevent him from doing it because black counterfactual intervention is not an obstacle to his choice. It is precisely a counterfactual obstacle. According to Vivlin, black does not prevent Jones from choosing to spare Smith. The truth is black would prevent Jones from doing it if he showed the sign that he's going to do it. In that respect, a counterfactual intervention is very similar to causal determinism. Black's counterfactual intervention ensures that Jones will not choose to spare Smith, but not that he cannot, that he is not free to choose to spare Smith. To think otherwise would be committing the fatalist fallacy. Being an incompatibilist, I'm not convinced. I find very intuitive to say that Black's possible intervention is sufficient to deprive Jones of his freedom to choose. I don't deny the similarity between Black's counterfactual intervention and causal determinism, but I am more disposed to draw an opposite conclusion. To my mind, this case shows that an agent's freedom to do otherwise can be removed by something else than external or internal obstacles. Option number 2. Another option for the conditionalist is to accept the premises, but once again to deny the conclusion by rejecting the modal transfer of unavoidability on which the argument is based. Is this option open for the neo-conditionalist? I'm not sure, because if you reject the principle of transfer in this case, then why giving up the classical analysis? Anyway, this option is still available for the classical conditionalist. We have seen that our two arguments against conditionalism are based on a contentious rule of inference. I don't think it's a real problem for the incompatibilist, but I don't want to address this question. Still, it would be nice if we had an argument which does not rely on this model principle. In his paper, An Empirical Disproof of Determinism, Ghislain gives the framework of such an argument. Lehrer's idea is the following. It is logically possible that the choice sufficient for performing a given action is also a necessary condition for being able to perform this action. In other words, if S chooses to do A, S will do A. But if S does not choose to do A, S cannot do A. And S does not choose to do A. This argument seems to be very powerful. The mere logical consistency of the three premises is sufficient to prove the falsity of the classical conditional analysis, because from these three premises, we can infer by modus ponens that S cannot do A. And if it is true that S cannot do A, then, Peichy the conditionalist, the premise 1 cannot be the analysis of S is free to do A. What type of scenario could illustrate this argument? Lehrer tells us a story about a demonic being which renders an agent unable to act, but as Kadri Vivlin observes, he doesn't give enough details. Vivlin proposes the following scenario. Alice is a concert pianist on strike. Just before the start of the concert, she makes a choice. I will not play tonight. To punish her, a demonic being pushes a button connected with an electronic device implanted in her brain and paralyzes Alice. The demonic being then tells Alice that she will remain paralyzed until she changes her mind and chooses to play the piano. But Alice does not choose to play. This case provides us with a good argument against the classical conditionalism. This is not the third argument. So the argument is, first step, if Alice chooses to play, she will play. Second step, if Alice does not choose to play, she cannot play because she's paralyzed. But Alice does not choose to play, therefore she cannot play the piano. But since Alice lacks the causal basis required for playing the piano, the new conditional analysis is immune to this argument. In this case, a neo-conditionalist will say that Alice cannot play the piano. As Kadri-Vivlin remarks, Alice suffers from a thinkish lack of ability. We have a thinkish lack of ability when an agent who lacks the narrow ability to do A, because he lacks the causal basis required, would gain this ability if he chose to do A, thanks to a change of his causal basis. Before going further, I want to point out a problem for the neo-conditionalist. Sure, Alice is unable to play, but still, isn't she blameworthy for not playing? I think she is. I think the audience would be right to blame Alice for not playing, because after all, she was able to regain the ability to play. So Alice is indirectly responsible for not giving her concert. When I say indirectly responsible, I mean that she is blameworthy for not giving her concert because she is blameworthy for being unable to give her concert. But if Alice is responsible for her omission, then it seems that having the causal basis required for doing A is not a necessary condition for being free to do A in the sense required for more responsibility. This objection was raised by Neil Levi in 2008. But now I want to focus on a last argument inspired by Lehrer's objection. In her paper Soft Determinism, Elizabeth Anscombe improved Lehrer's criticism of conditionalism by giving a new type of scenario which is also effective against neo-conditionalism. At least this is what I think. I may be wrong, but I think that Anscombe's paper has received less attention than it deserves. So this is an attempt to convince you that anyone interested in conditionalism should read it carefully. Here is an Anscombe-style scenario. Mary is a lawyer. She's having a talk with her client who is in prison. She is locked in a cell with him, and of course, neither Mary nor her client have the keys to unlock the door. So Mary cannot go out, but she knows that if she wants to, she just has to speak over the intercom to the warder and ask him to go out. The warder will be there within 5 minutes, and he will unlock the door. But Mary does not choose to go out. This case gives us an effective argument against classical conditionalism. This is the third argument. First step, if Mary chooses to go out, she will go out. The door will be unlocked 5 minutes later by the warder. Second step, if Mary does not choose to go out, she cannot go out because the door is locked. But Mary does not choose to go out. She prefers to stay with her client. Therefore, Mary cannot go out. She is not free to go out because she is locked in the cell. Once again, the agent's causal basis is untouched. So we also have a better argument against neo-conditionalism. First step, Mary has the causal basis required for choosing to go out and going out, and if Mary chooses to go out, she will go out. If Mary does not choose to go out, she cannot go out. But Mary does not choose to go out, therefore Mary cannot go out. Since the first premise is true, the neo-conditionalist must say that now Mary is free to go out, but I think this is very doubtful. I would rather say that she will be free to go out in 5 minutes if she asks so, but now she's not free to go out. The conditionalist might reply that the incompatibilist commits the fallacy of equivocation because cannot does not have the same meaning in the premise 2 and in the conclusion drawn by the incompatibilist. Indeed, he might claim that we have an ambiguity between the can of physical possibility and the can of freedom. The incompatibilist wants to draw the conclusion that Mary is not free to go out. But the conditionalist might reply that he has no right to draw such a conclusion. From the premises, we should only conclude that Mary does not have the causal possibility to go out, and that is compatible with the claim that Mary is free to go out. The neo-conditionalist, for example, might accept that now Mary cannot go out in the causal or physical sense of can, but not in the freedom sense of can, because if Mary were not free to go out, it would mean that either Mary does not have the causal basis required for going out, or that Mary will not go out if she chooses so. But the scenario says that Mary has the causal basis required, and that she will go out if she chooses so. Therefore, Mary is free to go out. The dialectical situation is a bit confusing. Everyone will agree that if Mary does not choose to go out, she does not have the causal possibility to go out. From an incompatibilist viewpoint, there is no equivocation between two senses of cannot, because freedom requires causal possibility. So, according to the incompatibilist, as long as Mary does not choose to go out, she is not free to go out. However, from a neo-conditionalist viewpoint, if Mary does not choose to go out, she is nevertheless free to go out, since she has the causal basis required and she can go out at will. For the conditionalist, the locked door does not prevent Mary from going out, since it will be unlocked if she wants to. He will say that the locked door is a physical obstacle, but this type of obstacle does not remove Mary's freedom to go out. Now, I believe that the conditionalist claim goes against common sense, for it seems obvious to me that Mary is not free to go out now because there is an obstacle in her way. As Anscombe points out, an obstacle is something which can go against the will, something which can resist to the will. But in this case, Mary couldn't go out simply by opening the door. She has to ask and then to wait for the opening of the door 5 minutes later. So there is something which resists to her will. During these 5 minutes, Mary is not free to go out, and as far as I can see, the neo-conditionalist cannot explain why. You might think that in the end, Anscombe's argument just raises a minor technical difficulty for the new conditional analysis of the ability to act. Maybe. But just think about it. We can always describe a situation where an obstacle prevents an agent from performing an action, and even if the obstacle is removed to give him back the ability to do it, there will always be a period of time during which the agent will remain unable to act according to common sense. So, if the neo-conditionalist claims that the agent can perform the action during this period of time, he will have to explain his meaning of can. And if he claims that the agent cannot perform the action during this period of time, he will have to change his analysis of the ability to act. Finally, I propose that we examine the Anscombe-style scenario from the perspective of Mary's moral responsibility. Consider the following variation of our story. I skip the first paragraph because it's the same story as before. So this time, suppose that there is another lawyer, Mark, who is waiting outside the cell. Suddenly, Mark has an anxiety attack and he calls for help. Mary has in her purse a medicine for anxiety, so she has a moral obligation to go out and give Mark this medicine. Mary knows that, but she does not choose to go out because she hates Mark. Is Mary blameworthy for not helping Mark? Yes, she clearly is. But it is interesting to see that the incompatibilist and the conditionalist won't agree on a significant point concerning Mary's responsibility. Is she directly or indirectly responsible for omitting to help Mark? The conditionalist must reply that this is a case of direct responsibility. But I think it is obvious that this is a case of indirect responsibility, because in these circumstances, Mary was unable to help Mark directly simply by opening the door and give him the medicine he needed. I think that this moral intuition supports the metaphysical intuition that leeway incompatibilism is true. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe my moral intuition is derived from my metaphysical intuition. Thank you.